She heard something on her morning run that stopped her cold. Not a scream, not a voice, just a shoe. One small red shoe, sitting at the edge of a pedestrian bridge over the Jordan River in Draper, Utah. The jogger slowed down. She looked around. And then she saw signs of a violent struggle. Dark, unmistakable stains marking the concrete, trailing across the railing and leading toward the water below. She told herself it was probably an animal. She called 911 anyway. That call came in at 10:30 in the morning on March 11, 2012. Draper police responded within minutes. What they found on that bridge was not the aftermath of an animal. The physical evidence left behind was completely wrong for that. Forensics quickly confirmed it was human. The search for the river began immediately. They put a helicopter in the air. What nobody on that bridge knew yet was that 15 hours earlier, in a quiet house in the suburb of Riverton just a few miles away, a 15-year-old girl named Annie Kasperzak had vanished from her bedroom. At 9 p.m. on March 10th, Annie's mother, Veronica, had come out of the shower and walked down the hall to check on her daughter. The room was empty. Her stepfather, James, searched the bed, the closet, and under the furniture. And then, tucked beneath the blanket, he found a folded piece of paper. It was a note. In Annie's handwriting, it said, "I lied to my friends. I told them I was pregnant, but I only wanted their sympathy. My only way out is to run away. Please don't try to find me. I don't want to be found." Veronica and James read it twice. Then James pulled out his phone and opened the family tracking app. Annie's signal was moving, not walking, moving fast like a car. They watched it on the screen in real time, the little dot sliding across the map of South Salt Lake County. Then it slowed, then it stopped completely. Then the signal cut out and disappeared. Gone. Veronica called Annie's phone straight to voicemail. She called again. Voicemail. She got in the car and drove to the Walmart nearest to where the signal had stopped, walked the aisles with a photo of her daughter, showed it to employees, asked every shopper she passed. Nobody had seen her. She drove home. She kept calling. Every call went nowhere. When police arrived, they logged Annie as a runaway. Not missing, runaway, because the note under her blanket said so, and because she had a history of dramatic exits followed by quiet returns. On the surface, it looked like a teenager making a point. It was a normal, logical administrative decision, and it would cost the investigation more than 2 years. The next morning, the helicopter searching the Jordan River found a body. It was caught in the branches of a fallen tree approximately 1 mile downstream from the pedestrian bridge. The body was that of a young female, and the injuries, the investigators who pulled her from the water would later struggle to find language for what they saw. The physical trauma was staggering. The injuries were so severe, so utterly catastrophic and complete, that the detectives on scene could not determine the victim's race. They could not estimate her age with any accuracy. When Draper police held their press conference that afternoon, they described the unidentified victim as an Asian female, approximately 20 years old. Veronica and James were watching from their living room. For one moment, one single breath, Veronica felt something close to relief. That description didn't match Annie. The age was wrong. The race was wrong. It wasn't her daughter. Then the reporter mentioned the shoe. A single child-sized red shoe was found on the concrete. James had bought Annie a pair of red shoes for Valentine's Day 6 weeks earlier. She had seen them in a store and lit up. He said she could talk him into almost anything, and those shoes were proof. She wore them every single day. Veronica picked up the phone and called the tip line. The fragile hope she had held onto for less than a minute evaporated completely. She described Annie, the dental braces, the scar from a gallbladder surgery, the red shoes. She gave them everything she had. This is the case of Annie Kasperzak. An investigation that would consume a small-town police department, send detectives chasing a manufactured ghost for a year, and ultimately claim the life of the lead investigator before it could ever be solved, because the person who destroyed Annie's life didn't flee. He stayed. He posted tributes online. He told her grieving classmates to wear red in her memory. He even answered the phone when Annie's mother called in a panic on the night she vanished and calmly lied straight to her face. Annie left a note that said she was running away because of a lie she had told. But she didn't run away. She went to meet someone, and whoever she went to meet, they already knew she wasn't coming back. Before Annie Kasperzak became a case number, she was a girl who kept a diary. She wrote in it constantly about her brothers, about school, about the life she was finally, carefully building. And in the spring of 2011, she wrote 7 words that would eventually lead investigators to the truth and to the person who took everything from her. There's a kid in my math class I really like. But to understand why those words mattered, you have to understand what Annie's life looked like before she ever picked up that pen. She was born in January 1997. By the time she was 9 years old, she had been placed with 9 different foster families, 9 homes, 9 sets of people who looked at her and decided she wasn't the right fit. 9 times, she packed whatever she had and moved somewhere new. That kind of rejection doesn't just hurt. It rewires the way a child understands love, teaches her that belonging is temporary, that people leave, that she is somehow the reason they do. That belief doesn't vanish the moment someone finally chooses to stay. It follows you into every relationship you ever have. Veronica Kasperzak was Annie's caseworker at Utah's Division of Children and Family Services. Her job was to find homes for children who didn't have one. She had watched Annie cycle through family after family, and she had reached a point where she simply couldn't do it again. When Annie came back for the 9th time, Veronica made a decision that had nothing to do with professional obligation. She was 6 months pregnant. She already had a husband and a life that was about to get significantly more complicated. She adopted Annie anyway, because she looked at this child and saw exactly what she was, a girl who deserved to stop moving. For the first time in her life, Annie had a permanent address. She had younger brothers who idolized her and followed her around the house. She had a stepfather, James Bratcher, who she had wrapped around her finger within the first few months, a man who would later say she could talk him into almost anything. She crocheted. She adored animals. She had a plan for her future. She wanted to become a therapist because she knew from the inside what it felt like to be a child in chaos, and she wanted to be the person who helped other kids find their way through it. She even asked Veronica to adopt more children. She was, by every account, a girl who had finally come alive. And then she met Chris. His full name was Darwin Christopher Bagshaw. They were in the same math class at Summit Academy. Annie wrote about him in her diary from the beginning, the way she wrote about everything that mattered to her, all in. They started dating in 2011, on and off for 18 months, the way teenage relationships tend to go: fights, breakups, reconciliations. For most 15-year-olds, that kind of turbulence is just background noise. For Annie, a girl who had been abandoned 9 times before her 9th birthday, an 18-month relationship was the longest consistent bond she had ever formed outside her adoptive family. When things were good between them, she was completely in. When she felt him pulling away, she panicked. She took a pregnancy test in early 2012. It came back negative. Her mother had helped her get on birth control. She knew with complete certainty that she was not pregnant. She told Chris she was anyway. She told her friends. She wrote it in her diary as though it were true. The way you write something down, hoping the act of writing it will make it real. On March 1st, 2012, 9 days before she died, she wrote that Chris had found out and that she didn't think he wanted the baby. That entry was the last one that mentioned him by name. On the evening of March 10th, Veronica and James went out for dinner. Annie stayed home to babysit her brothers. By all accounts, the evening started normally. Then her phone rang. A blocked number. She answered. The call lasted 19 minutes. Something was said. The call ended. The phone rang again, blocked. The same number 5 more minutes. Then a third call, 4 minutes. Phone records would later show the pattern clearly. Someone called her 3 times that night from a number they didn't want traced, and by the end of those calls, something had been decided. Veronica noticed one detail when she got home. Annie had changed out of her shorts and into jeans. She assumed her daughter was cold. She went to shower. She didn't think anything of it. Annie wrote the note. She tucked it under her blanket, and sometime before 9 p.m. she walked out of the house to meet the person who had been calling her. Not a stranger, someone she trusted. Someone who, when Veronica called him an hour later in a blind panic, picked up on the second ring and said he hadn't seen Annie. He had no idea where she was. He sounded genuinely worried. Then he offered a name, LJ. A gang member, he said. Older, dangerous. Someone Annie had apparently been involved with behind everyone's backs. He'd never met LJ personally, never seen him, never spoken to him in person, but he'd heard things, bad things. Veronica had never heard the name before. Neither did any of the investigators. Police now had 2 threads to pull, a mysterious figure named LJ, whom nobody could identify, and a boyfriend who had been one of the last people to speak with Annie before she disappeared. Then, exactly 1 week after Annie's body was found in that river, a woman walked into a police station in the neighboring town of West Jordan. She said she had witnessed the murder. She said she knew exactly who LJ was. She said she could give them everything: a name, a location, details that matched the crime scene perfectly. For the next year, everybody believed her. Her name was Joanna Franklin, and she walked into a police station like she was doing everyone a favor. She had been picked up in West Jordan, the town neighboring Draper, on fraud charges. During her intake interview, she leaned forward and told the officer she had information about the girl found in the river. She had seen what happened. She knew who did it. She would give them everything: names, details, a full account. But she needed something first: immunity for her pending charges. Detective Johnson agreed, and then Joanna started talking. She described a house party, a young girl arriving with a man nobody knew well. At some point, the girl and this man disappeared into a back room together. When they came back out, the host of the party approached the girl and made a move on her, right there in front of the group. The girl didn't just say no, she laughed at him, in front of everyone. And this man, the host, was not someone who absorbed humiliation quietly. He attacked her with extreme force, escalating the situation instantly. He continued the assault while she was on the floor. He stood over her and said, "Don't laugh at me." The girl was unconscious but still breathing. 3 men carried her out of the apartment, wrapped her in a tarp, loaded her into a vehicle, and drove toward the canyon. When they came back hours later, she wasn't with them. When someone asked what had happened, the answer came back casual, almost bored: she went swimming. Detective Johnson had the address within hours. The man Joanna named was Daniel Robert Lehigh Ferry, 33 years old, known gang member, convicted felon, drug dealer with a rap sheet long enough that Johnson had actually executed a search warrant at that same address before on a completely unrelated case. Ferry was not a stranger to law enforcement. He was exactly the kind of person investigators imagined when they heard the words gang member, house party, and violent assault. Everything Joanna described fit him like a glove. Police executed a search warrant on Ferry's apartment. What they found inside stopped the team cold. The carpet had been ripped up entirely, not worn out, not replaced in a renovation, but torn up and removed. The walls had been freshly painted, the kind of hasty coat you put over something you need to hide quickly. And on the interior door to the main room, there was a massive impact hole. The shape and placement of it made it clear that a significant violent struggle had taken place right there against the wood. Along the walls and door frame, there were dark reddish stains that looked exactly like dried blood. Joanna had described a girl's head being slammed into a wall with enough force to send blood across the ceiling. Standing in that apartment, everything she said was playing out in front of them physically. This was a cover-up. The evidence of violence had been scrubbed, painted over, and torn away, but not completely enough. On March 19, 2012, Daniel Ferry was arrested for the murder of Annie Kasperzak. When detectives brought him in and showed him Annie's photograph, his reaction was not what they expected. He didn't go cold or deflect carefully. He looked genuinely confused. "Who the hell is Anne?" he said. They took that as performance. They had seen it before: the practiced bewilderment, the wide eyes. They were not moved. Ferry's close friend Vianuia Vehekite was arrested days later as an alleged accomplice. He was released within 48 hours. There was nothing connecting him to the crime. But Ferry stayed in custody. The blood samples from the walls were sent to the lab. The investigation moved forward with the momentum it hadn't had since the body was found. Then the lab results came back. The blood on Ferry's walls was not Annie's, not even close. No DNA match. And when investigators pulled his phone records for the night of March 10th, they couldn't place him anywhere near the Jordan River. Not at the bridge, not at the canyon, not within range of any tower near the crime scene. And then came the alibi. Daniel Ferry had not been at a house party the night Annie was murdered. He had not been at the river. He had been committing an entirely separate crime, a kidnapping. A real one, documented, with a living victim who could describe exactly where Ferry had been, what he had done, and when. 2 crimes could not have happened in 2 different locations at the exact same time. It was physically impossible. Ferry could not have killed Annie. He had been too busy doing something else entirely. On March 6, 2013, Draper police publicly cleared Daniel Ferry of any involvement in Annie Kasperzak's murder. He eventually pleaded guilty to the kidnapping and related drug charges, up to 15 years in prison. As officers led him out of the courtroom after sentencing, his wife called out from the gallery, "Love ya, Dan." He turned, smiled at her, and said, "See ya later." 1 full year had been consumed chasing a story that was never true. Joanna Franklin would testify under oath 3 years later at a hearing connected to the actual killer's case. She sat on the stand and said, "I tweaked it to be what he wanted to hear. I lied. I don't even know all the stories I told. But they weren't true." She had been angry at Ferry for cutting off her illegal supply days before Annie's murder. That was the entire reason. A personal grudge over drugs had redirected a homicide investigation for 12 months, allowed a real killer to walk free, and left a family with no answers while the grief calcified inside them. The investigation had nothing now, no suspect, no forensic connection. No witnesses are willing to tell the truth, and the detective who had spent a year building this case, who had worked it obsessively, who had barely slept, who had 90 voicemails waiting for him, the one morning he finally came home, was about to run out of time in the worst possible way. With Ferry cleared, the case went back to zero, and then it very nearly disappeared forever. On September 1st, 2013, Sergeant Derek Johnson pulled over to help a stranded motorist near the end of his shift. It ended in a tragic attack. Without warning, the driver turned violent. Sergeant Johnson was fatally wounded and lost his life at the scene. He had a wife, a young son, and a murder case he had carried home with him every single night for the past 18 months, a case about a 15-year-old girl found in a river, a case that had consumed him so completely that his widow would later say there were days he simply didn't come home at all. The one morning he finally did, there were 90 voicemails waiting on his phone. He never saw Annie's case closed. Everything Johnson knew, every instinct he had developed, every detail he had mentally filed but never written down, died with him on that road. What he left behind in the filing cabinet was a collection of incomplete reports, search warrants with no documentation, and interviews that had been conducted but never formally recorded. For a case this serious in a department this small, it was a catastrophic gap. That filing cabinet was handed to Detective Jacqueline Moore. Moore was new to investigations. This was the most serious case she had ever been assigned. She opened the drawer, took out the files, and began working through what was there, which was far less than there should have been. And at the back of the drawer, beneath everything else, she found a thick stack of AT&T phone records. 35,000 rows of comma-separated data. Chris Bagshaw's phone records, obtained early in the investigation by Johnson, were never fully analyzed by anyone. She looked at them. The columns of numbers meant nothing to her. She put them back in the drawer. A less determined detective might have left them there. Moore didn't. In early 2014, she paid out of her own pocket to attend a week-long cell phone forensics seminar being held in Salt Lake City. She sat through every session. She took notes. And at the end of the final day, she approached the expert running the course, one of the most experienced cell phone analysts in the country, and quietly asked if he would look at something. She handed him a digital copy of the file. He opened it on his laptop and began scrolling through 35,000 records. Halfway through, he stopped. He had been doing this work for 20 years. He had seen this particular pattern once before in all that time. He highlighted the row and turned to Moore. "This call right here," he said. "I don't know what it means yet, but it's a big deal." The call had come in at 9 p.m. on March 10, 2012. It lasted 1 minute and 59 seconds. During those 119 seconds, Chris Bagshaw's phone connected to 4 different cell towers, 25 times. To understand why that number is extraordinary, consider this. A phone traveling at highway speed for 8 hours across open country might accumulate that many tower connections. A phone sitting completely still for under 2 minutes should connect to 2 towers, maybe 3. 25 handoffs in under 2 minutes means the phone was somewhere so geographically isolated, so cut off from reliable signal that it kept jumping frantically between the only 4 towers it could reach, over and over like a device trapped in a dead zone. Desperately searching for anything strong enough to hold, the expert packed nearly $1 million worth of signal mapping equipment into his truck and drove to Salt Lake County. He ran grid pattern drive tests across the entire overlap zone of those 4 towers. He mapped the signal strength at hundreds of different points. He built a heat map, a visual record of where exactly in that geography a phone would behave the way Bagshaw's had. The results narrowed to a single zone, a natural depression carved by the river. a place where the terrain blocked every other tower and left only 4 fighting for dominance. The center of that heat map was the pedestrian bridge over the Jordan River, the same bridge where the jogger had found the blood, the same bridge where Annie's shoe had been sitting on the concrete. At 9 p.m. on the night Annie Kasperzak was murdered, Chris Bagshaw's phone was at that bridge. And at the exact moment his phone registered those 25 desperate handoffs, it rang. The incoming call was from Veronica, Annie's mother, calling every person in her daughter's life, trying to find out where she was. He answered. He said he hadn't seen Annie. He said she was probably on her way home. A second call came in minutes later, and the tower data shifted. His phone had moved not far, but specifically, the data placed him on the bridge itself, the crossing directly above the water. He was standing there watching, making sure the current was moving, making sure Annie was going downstream and not back. Then he got on his BMX bike and rode home. Moore brought everything to the district attorney's office. The DA looked at what she had and said something that should have been devastating, but wasn't. He said that with the gaps in Johnson's documentation, a defendant could walk into the lobby right now and confess, and he wasn't certain they could secure a conviction. The foundation of the original investigation was too damaged, but the cell tower data didn't need Johnson's reports to stand on its own. Neither did the evidence on the shoes, which a second forensic expert had now confirmed was caused by high-velocity impact rather than an ordinary accident. Neither did the text message Bagshaw had sent coaching his friend Spencer to lie. Neither did the jailhouse confession he had made to another inmate while waiting in juvenile detention. Neither did the phone alibi his father and grandmother had provided, which his own call records proved was fabricated. Taken together, it was enough, just barely enough. In October 2014, undercover officers approached a teenager walking to school in Grand Junction, Colorado. They told him he was under arrest for the murder of Annie Kasperzak. He went completely silent. Then, slowly, he said, "I thought I proved myself innocent. Not, I didn't do it. Not, you have the wrong person." 5 words that told investigators everything they needed to know about what the next 18 months would look like and exactly how it would end. On February 29, 2016, 1 week before his trial was set to begin, Darwin Christopher Bagshaw stood before a judge and said one word: guilty. No deal had been offered. No negotiation had taken place. His defense attorney told the court afterward that Bagshaw had made the decision himself, alone, while preparing for trial the previous Friday. There was no agreement, no reduction. He pleaded guilty to first-degree felony murder exactly as charged, and he did it because he chose to. But in Utah, guilty is not the end of the conversation. Utah law requires something called an allocution, a verbal account of the crime, spoken by the defendant in open court on the record. A defendant cannot simply enter a plea and sit down. The judge requires them to describe, in their own words, what they did and how they did it. And so, at 18 years old, Darwin Christopher Bagshaw stood in a Salt Lake City courtroom and described the night of March 10, 2012. He had arranged to meet Annie at the river. She came. She told him she was pregnant and that they needed to run away together. He had a shovel with him. His defense attorney would say he found it lying on the Jordan Parkway. Prosecutors said he brought it. What both sides agreed on was what happened next. He used the tool to carry out the attack. The medical examiner would later confirm the sheer violence and repetitive nature of the assault. When it was over, he carried her to the water and dropped her in. Then he walked to the bridge and stood there watching until the current took her downstream. Then his phone rang. It was Veronica. What the allocution also revealed for the first time publicly was what he had originally planned to do with her body. He had not come to the river only to kill Annie. He had come to bury her. He had intended to dig a hole deep enough that she would never be found, that the search would go on forever, that her family would never have the specific horror of knowing for certain. It was March in Utah. The ground was frozen solid. He couldn't break through it, so he used the river instead. Annie Kasperzak was found because the earth in March was too hard to dig. April 25, 2016. The Matheson Courthouse in Salt Lake City. The Kasperzak family filled one side of the room. Bagshaw stood at the defense table, 18 years old, about to hear what the people who loved Annie had to say to him directly. Dennis Kasperzak went first. He spoke for 25 minutes. He did not read from a prepared statement. He talked the way a man talks when the grief has had 4 years to turn into something harder and more complicated than sadness. He described what the investigation had cost his family, His second marriage had collapsed under the weight of it. He had turned to alcohol and drugs to get through the years when there were no answers and no end in sight. He described driving to the morgue. He described walking in. He described what he saw on the table in front of him. "What I saw there, Your Honor, wasn't my daughter." The sheer force of the trauma and the anger and the rage, it was clear evidence of a sustained, unyielding attack. The medical examiner confirmed the repetitive nature of what happened. "The only thing that told me it was my daughter, the only identifiable feature of my baby girl was a small dimple on her chin." He paused. "Otherwise, it wasn't her." Jennifer Kasperzak followed. She kept it short because short was all she could manage. "I want her back," she said. "He not only took her life, but he also took all of our lives." Then Veronica stood up. She opened Annie's diary, not to the entries about Chris, not to the pages about the pregnancy lie or the plan to run away. She opened it to a list Annie had written, 25 reasons she liked herself. A 15-year-old girl who had been rejected by 9 families before her 9th birthday, who had spent her early childhood being told in every way a child can be told that she was not worth keeping, and who had sat down one day and written out 25 specific reasons she disagreed. Veronica read every single one of them out loud in a courtroom where the boy who killed her daughter was standing 5 feet away. When she finished, she looked directly at Bagshaw. "Her only mistake was falling in love with the hope of a future with you. You took her away from us because you thought she would complicate your life." She stopped. "Then don't think for a moment that, because I forgive you, that I will ever forget." She meant it as a promise, not a threat. She would be at every parole hearing, every single one, for as long as it took. Bagshaw stood to speak last. He said he was sorry. He said he wanted to apologize to Annie's family, to his own family, to everyone in the courtroom. His voice was soft. His attorney said afterward that he felt at peace. Judge James Blanche sentenced him to 15 years to life in prison. Before he announced the sentence, he said, "Words fail when one imposes sentencing in a case like this. A terrible crime deserves a serious sentence, and here we have about the worst crime that one can possibly imagine." Darwin Christopher Bagshaw's first parole hearing is scheduled for October 2034. Veronica will be there. Annie Grace Kasperzak was a girl who crocheted and loved animals and wanted to become a therapist because she knew from the inside what it felt like to be a child who needed one. She wanted her family to keep growing. She asked Veronica to adopt more children, told her there were kids out there who needed what she had finally found. After Annie died, Veronica and James adopted 5 more. The family Annie dreamed of still exists because she wanted it badly enough to say so out loud. Her ashes were scattered in the ocean, not in one place, everywhere, so that wherever her family traveled, whatever water they stood beside, she would already be there. He came to that river with a shovel and a plan to make her disappear. He failed. She is still here.